Welcome to the Erasing Shame Podcast, Season 1. This podcast is about erasing shame through honest talk for healthy living, emotionally, relationally, mentally, and personally. Visit our website at erasingshame.com for links to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe on iTunes and YouTube. Now, let's have an honest talk for healthy living. And we have a special guest named Sam Louie. He is a psychotherapist, writer, and speaker on issues related to addictions, trauma, and cultural shame. Sam is the author of Asian Shame and Addiction, Suffering in Silence, and also Slanted Eyes, the Asian American Poetic Experience. On a personal note, Sam is a first-generation Chinese immigrant from Hong Kong who grew up amidst 3 generations of addiction. Wow. Well, Sam, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you for providing this space and for having me on.
Well, and I want to mention to our audience that we have a special announcement at the end of this show, so stay tuned for that, or if you're listening on demand, you can fast forward to the end. But Sam, so you've had quite a varied journey in your life experience. You used to also be involved in journalism. So how did you become a psychotherapist, and when did you discover that shame was such a critical issue?
So I worked a number of years in television news, and I went through a divorce back in 2002. So, just over 15 years ago. I had a lot of shame, but because I was going to a relatively progressive Asian American church where the pastor was Chinese American, and he talked about his own therapy and going to marital counseling. And once he found out about my situation, he really recommended it. So having somebody I looked up to, similar Asian background, who not only advocated for therapy, but also went himself, got me into therapy. So once I went into therapy, I just started learning a lot more about my culture. I know that sounds a little odd because up until then, I just lived it every day. Mm-hmm. And there's a phrase that says something to the effect of, the fish is sometimes the last to know it's in water. Mm-hmm. Which was very applicable to me because I was wondering, hey, it's taking a white therapist to help me understand my own cultural background, even though I was ensconced in it. And so, that's kind of the long and short of how I made the transition. And slowly, I just kept thinking about therapy and psychology, and even the stories I was promoting were related to mental health, therapy, addictions, culture, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, you wrote a book on it, so I'm sure we can talk hours about this, but we have about 30 minutes. We don't have a deadline, so we can let this run if we have a thought that really needs to be considered. But as you got into therapy, there's a whole range of issues that people deal with, and it sounds like you gravitated toward this area of shame and trauma. So can you describe what you've learned in that process, both from your training and your personal experience?
In a very succinct way, I would tell you that having lived amidst a minimum of 3 generations, meaning my grandparents, aunts and uncles, a lesser degree with my parents, and then my current generation, me and my 2 younger brothers, I realized that kind of collectively, we as a family, we struggled with addictions that weren't necessarily diagnosed. Nobody was going to see a counselor for any of the various addictions. And, I'm not ashamed to say it, but I think gambling was a big component in our family.
But there's also, that counts.
Yeah, that counts. There was also some sexual stuff here and there with, relatives, and you just hear things, but you don't really know because things are kind of swept underneath the rug. And then once it came to my generation, my own issues with my own addictions, and it kind of just snowballed and steamrolled.
And when you say three generation, was it something that became a pattern in your family, or just because of this nature of a addictive personality? Help unpack a bit of that, because not everybody who experiences shame goes to an addiction.
Yeah, that's a good point. So in therapy, we call this the generational transmission of emotions. So a lot of times families are likely to pass down certain relational patterns. And in a nutshell, what that means is, how do we talk about our real thoughts and feelings, our real emotions? Can you show them? Are there safe places to do so? Can we talk about our fears, our disappointments, our hurts, our wounds? In my family, you're fine if you're happy, you're putting on a good face, everybody's having fun. That's what's allowed. But anything underneath that is not allowed. And then you start feeling you can't really express this part of you that is so universal. And so those feelings are going to get submerged or repressed. And eventually it needs a way out. But because there's the cultural shame element that's impacting, me, because of my Chinese background, I really didn't have an outlet. I was like, I can't express it, so I need to find another coping mechanism, and hence compulsive things started taking root probably as early as 7 or 8 years old, maybe even earlier.
Wow. And given this situation, what you've experienced actually is not abnormal for many Asians in Asian culture, that it's just not common to talk about feelings or express your feelings or your thoughts or your pains. That Asian culture has generations of suppressing that. In Mandarin, my family's Mandarin, they even have a term called shuku, which is eating bitterness.
Wow.
And and I think in the Korean culture, they have something called han, where you're just able to take in all this suffering and somehow survive, not thrive. But that seems to be an Asian value. And in some other cultures, they also don't talk about feelings too. So how do you get to a place? I mean, do you have to do you have to forego your Asian culture in order to find health? Or how do you deal with that?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm very proud of my Asian heritage background, but I also know that due to some of the cultural constraints, it was fairly limiting. And when I talk about that, that might go hand in hand with this element of cultural shame, because shame has I like to say it's two sides of the same coin. One side we have shame, the other side we have honor. What we predicate our entire lives upon: honoring our families, honoring our relatives, honoring our dead ancestors, honoring the wider Asian community, and or if you're living in Asia, the country of origin that you belong to.
And I think recently I read something from you that you described how shame has a cultural root, particularly for those from the Asian context. Can you say a little bit more about that and describe for our audience, because some of our audience is not from an Asian background. So if you can say a bit more about the shame and honor thing as well.
Yeah, I might liken it to a three-headed monster of sorts. We have shame, we have trauma, and then we have the shame, trauma, and then we got the addiction piece that kind of feeds. They're all kind of interconnected. Obviously, you can have one without the other, but a lot of just regular therapy books, you're going to see, if you look up trauma and addiction, you're going to see a whole host of different books just with that particular piece. But then I bring in the cultural element, because in grad school, most folks didn't really, or the professors, there's not a lot of literature on cultural shame, at least when I was in graduate school. And I was like, wait, there's something that I'm experiencing that's much deeper, much more wounding, And I don't know how to articulate it because there's no books written about it.
And so what did you discover?
So there's been a study, just like how Eskimos have more than 50 words to describe snow. At least in the Chinese culture, they found that there are more than 100 different phrases related to shame.
Wow.
100 different phrases. I'll read a couple of you. I mean, some of them are, well, here's one that's pretty profound. So ashamed that the ancestors of 8 generations can't even feel it.
Wow.
Are you familiar? There's a Native American, they have a similar one, but it's based on a different principle. It's called the 7th generation principle. And it's more in terms of ecology and wildlife preservation, that whatever decision we make or action we take, with earth, animals, that sort of thing, that we have to think about the descendants, that for the next 7 generations, how will it impact them? So kind of in that same vein, for Asian cultures, we are being taught, whether it's explicitly, because I've met some folks from China who've told me that they've actually heard these phrases expressed to them, that, you should be so ashamed that, 8 generations can possibly feel it. So whether it's expressed explicitly, it's still understood implicitly that if you're doing something, it's not even doing something, there's a lot of different areas of shame, but anything that could be shameful and or dishonoring could have an impact going back 8 generations. Wow. So we're always trying to, at least I've been told, to make sure you do whatever you can to save face, preserve your face, not necessarily for me, myself, but for the family and the wider, the community and our ancestors. That's how profound it is. And until I started doing more research, then it started making more sense how the cultural shame piece can tie into the addiction piece.
So you've talked about the culture piece. So talk a bit about the addiction piece. When does someone get to the point where they can't stop doing something? And then when do they get to the point where it really impairs their daily life? I think those are 2 distinct points, would you say?
Yeah, something that, let's say compulsive, you might feel yourself doing something periodically. Like, let's say you go on a Netflix binge. It's compulsive, okay, right? Like that harmful, but addictive, similar to what Roy mentioned in the last podcast, is it's getting to the point where you have made vows to yourself to stop something you've done repeatedly and you just can't do it. And there are obviously negative consequences. It goes against your sense of values. So that's when it starts getting more addictive. But I think on a more relational level, we're all taught to have secure, healthy attachments with our primary caregivers, those who are raising us. And if there are ruptures, trauma specifically, and it doesn't have to be, most people who are from a non-clinical setting, when they think of trauma, they're going to think of being a war-torn nation or, seeing people dying on the streets, in the inner city. And it doesn't necessarily need to be that extreme. It could be, such as myself, being a latchkey kid. That's traumatic in itself. And I have to get this reinforced by my therapist because sometimes I still try to dismiss it. Like, no, that's traumatic. You were neglected, not because your parents were neglectful per se, but they just did not have the emotional tools to provide nurturing, to provide comfort, praise, that sort of emotional intimacy that every child needs for what we call a secure attachment.
That's a nice thought, but when you have a whole culture that doesn't have it, it just seems like such a foreign concept.
It is. I mean, we're talking about concepts that go back, I like to say, since Confucius came around, because some of his principles are still very much alive today, even if you don't believe in Confucius philosophies, because so much of Confucianism is about collectivism. How do we bring about social order through conformity, obedience, hierarchical relationships that has no desire to bring forth an individual's thoughts, feelings, their sense of autonomy, challenging authority. These are Western concepts, this view of individualism. And for most countries, international countries outside of Europe, maybe Australia, North America, they're on the collectivist side.
Yes.
Group preservation and preserving the group, that is the ultimate. Keep in mind.
Yeah. Well, let's move towards the path of healing and wellness. So, what has helped you, and how do you help others towards healing and breaking the cycle of addiction and living a healthier life?
Well, that goes back to the title of the podcast, Erasing Shame. I mean, that is such a powerful metaphor. How do you shame reduction? That's what we're talking about. But it's so hard. I'll get to that point, but I want to emphasize we are doing something called going countercultural, because to try to minimize shame or erase shame in a lot of Asian thought processes, traditional Asian thought, you are actually doing something that would be considered very shameful. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah.
Well, so there's actually a term. Even a devil, this is translated from Mandarin, even a devil would be scared of one who doesn't want to maintain his or her face. That means if you have no regard for shame, you're trying to minimize shame or eliminate shame from your life. This is a virtue that's been promoted for 2,000 years at least, and now we're trying to take it away. It's going to be met with a lot of resistance from maybe traditional family members and so on and so forth, because their sense of because they're impacted by an individual shame as well.
Yes.
But getting to the point of healing, everybody's a little bit different, but I think for me, I really needed a sense of community where other people like myself, eyeball to eyeball, like, hey, I'm not, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm not defective, because part of the shame thought is I'm a bad, defective, flawed person to the core. There must be something really inherently wrong with me. And that's how I felt after my divorce. And I must be a despicable person. Like, what is wrong with me? That led me to, act out sexually, like that was kind of what started the whole snowball effect with the divorce. And, it took a couple of years of individual therapy was helpful. But for myself, what was really helpful was being surrounded by other men who were impacted similarly. And this is the other interesting piece, is most of them were not Asian, because, who's going to group therapy? Primarily Caucasian folks. But because they didn't have that level of shame to my degree, and they were able to come in week after week, I was able to kind of, by osmosis, so to speak, just soak up their ability to still feel good at the end of the day. Yeah, we may have done some things that we regret, but we inherently should not feel defective to the core. I know
I might be time for that to sink in.
Yeah, I might be simplifying that, because there's all kinds of different layers of shame. I mean, that is just one particular layer. Yeah. But, for me, that was probably the most healing aspect, that I didn't have to prove myself. I didn't have to do anything in terms of achievement. I could just be and be accepted. And the irony is, I think my faith really grew from that. My Christian faith was like, oh gosh, this is what I think the church message is about. But because I even had distorted images of acceptance and health, it impacted even my relationship with God and Christianity, because I came into the church with these messages of shame, cultural shame.
Yes. And sometimes religion can be a place that adds to that shame because they uphold a virtuous value for the community, and being people that are people, none of us can measure up.
Yeah, and let's say you have a church here, but if the overlay is traditional Asian values of shame, then whatever Christian values of unconditional love, acceptance, and so on and so forth, that can get really pushed down. So I'm glad you brought up the spiritual shame. I kind of did a cursory list of other various ways that we could feel shameful growing up. Academic shame, career shame, right? Like that's what I sometimes see people feeling like they're in the wrong career or made to feel bad about their career choices. Relational shame, this comes up a lot. They're dating either outside the wrong ethnicity, or they're dating somebody that one side of the family doesn't feel is good enough for whatever reason, right? We talked a little bit about the emotional shame, not being able to express your emotions or having shame for having emotions. Spiritual shame. Behavioral shame, just doing something that you feel is really shameful. There's victim shame. That one came up recently. And you're a victim of something and you feel very shameful about that. Think about the Me Too movement, sexual harassment, being sexually victimized or abused.
Yes.
I mean, folks, that level of shame is so deep and wounded that they feel they're the problem and defective. Growing up in America, this is another piece that might add to those who are minorities. Physical shame about who you are, because you might not feel you're measuring up compared to what is the standard of what society is accepting. In my eyes, society is accepting like a tall Caucasian. Think about the Ken Barbie, right? The dolls, right? I mean, that's what my image was. That's what a man's supposed to be. And then there's also cultural shame. You may have a sense of hating your culture, not liking your culture, wanting to minimize everything about yourself if you're a minority in a majority country such as the US, and you're made to stick out, and you're going to minimize certain parts of yourself.
Wow, that is an amazing list. I think you've just outlined our season 2 topics. We've done over 10 episodes now. We're discovering just how big of a thing this shame topic is. And there's so much in that darkness and silence that we're just beginning to understand as we have these conversations. And I think the title of your book points to that also, that shame causes us to suffer in silence.
Yeah.
And so, part of the reason we're doing this as a podcast and verbalizing it and not just writing it is to talk it out. And hopefully that will give people courage to step out of that darkness and get the help that they need.
DJ, you mentioned silence. Silence is one thing. Addictions is another avenue that people escape from. The other one is suicide, which is often understood among Western thought, because originally, at least from the Japanese perspective, if you're committing suicide, that actually is considered the ultimate act of honoring your family and regaining your sense of honor that you may have lost through whatever shameful thing you've done.
Wow.
I mean, that's why people are like, well, how come, like all these Asian countries have such high rates of suicide? I mean, yes, there's pressure to succeed, so on and so forth. But, there's this other piece that if you dishonor some aspect of your culture, your family, you can regain it if you commit suicide, which is not prevalent thought among Caucasian or Western populations.
Well, I hope we can be a part of changing that in our generation somehow.
Yeah, I think this is a great platform to address some of these, these needs and these concerns.
Yeah, in my conversation with some of the mental health workers around the world, that the people in social services and the government in Hong Kong and Japan are beginning to realize that there's something wrong with that kind of thinking. And so they're really treating this as a genuine health issue that they want to begin to change. So that's a hopeful sign. Well, as we wrap up, what is one thing that you would want to say to our audience who is struggling with addiction and shame?
Well, if you're acknowledging it, that's already a pretty good first step. The other piece that I've seen helped is people have been able. This was before I became a therapist. People came to me because at one point, I know this might sound a little crazy, but at one point I was the only Asian American person divorced at the particular church I was going to. At least that's what it felt like, visibly divorced, right?
Right.
And so a guy came up to me and said, "Hey, Sam, I want to talk to you. I want to confide to you because I'm going through X, Y, and Z." I'm like, "Why are you telling me?" He's like, "Well, because I know you wouldn't judge me."
Mm-hmm.
So finding somebody or feeling comfortable to confide in somebody, and knowing that that you can trust those close to you, that they aren't going to shame you, and knowing that there are people out there that are willing to kind of accept you just as you are, but also to walk alongside you. That was something that Roy mentioned that really caught my attention too. I mean, I had a lot of great friends, men and women, who walk alongside me that I thought that, gosh, if they really knew me, they would leave me. That's another component of how deep the shame is, that if somebody really knew the real me, they would leave me. And that's not true. That's the most powerful negative aspect of the shame message that I hope we dispel.
Very good. Thank you for the encouraging word. Tell us a little bit about your book. What kind of response have you gotten about your book, Asian Shame, Addiction, and Suffering in Silence?
I get good responses, but they're usually not posted on Amazon reviews because to post it, there's a shame element to it. It's been a great.
I would encourage our audience to get that book and write a review. There we go.
Suffering in Silence.
And then your website, samlouiemft.com.
Yeah, it stands for marriageandfamilytherapist.com.
Very good. We'll add that in our show notes at erasingshame.com. And our audience here, you can like our Facebook page, subscribe to us on YouTube or on iTunes. And the special announcement today, we just got awarded a grant so that we can produce a web series. It's going to be 10 episodes about erasing shame over mental health for Asian Americans. So that will be rolling out this summer. We're doing this in partnership with Asian American Christian Counseling Services. So very grateful for this opportunity. And we hope to continue this conversation and really reach people that are hurting and show them that they are not broken and that there is redemption and that there is hope. So Sam, thank you so much for being a part of Erasing Shame, and keep up the good work, and may the Lord bless you.
Thank you for having me, and congratulations on the grant.
Thank you, Sam. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Now, I don't have a great way to sign off.